Welcome to the Christian Men at Work podcast, where I interview men from all walks of life with varying job titles who have one thing in common. They are all choosing daily to live out their Christian faith through their work, and because of that, they are leading, prospering, glorifying God, and experiencing joy and purpose in their work. And you can too. Men at Work, welcome to episode 43. Before we get to our interview, I wanted to share another walking tip with you. I started this last episode, and this is just a quick tip to help you in your walk with the Lord. I've been seeking a deeper, more intimate relationship with Jesus, as well as others in my life. I recently was introduced to the teachings of Dan Mohler. I cannot say enough about how God has been speaking to me through Dan and his teaching about how Jesus didn't just come to get us to heaven or to bless us here on earth, but to transform our lives and our hearts. I encourage you to look up Dan Mohler, that's spelled Mohler, on YouTube, and check out all the free videos that are available. Today we're going to be speaking with Bill McGee, who served the last 13 years as the men's communities pastor and stewardship pastor at Compassion Christian Church in Savannah, Georgia. Bill started out in the corporate world working as a computer engineer and progressed to an executive position in IBM before God placed a call on his heart in 2005 to minister to men. As a pastor, the thing Bill enjoys the most is seeing men having a true encounter with God, and through that encounter, see them prioritize their lives and become the spiritual leaders they were created to be for their families. Let's get right to our interview with Bill McGee. Bill, thanks so much for joining the podcast today. Appreciate it. And I'm excited about this. I know you and I knew each other a number of years ago when I lived in Savannah, and I was really blessed being a part of the men's ministry that you were leading there. And so it's fun to kind of catch up and have a conversation after these years. But why don't we start out, if we could, by you just introducing yourself and answering the same question I ask everybody, which is, when and how did you become a Christian?
Okay. Well, Dave, first of all, it's great to be with you also. And I love starting there because, a lot of times people assume a lot about individuals, and I want to make sure that everyone knows, I guess, the position that we take on the topics we talk about. But my journey began many years ago as a teenager, where I was confused about what church was. The old saying, you had a drug problem, where your mom and dad drug you to church and then drug you home. And I was one of those people. I went to church because I just thought it was like anything else, like going to Rotary or whatever might be happening. It's just what happened in a small town. What I learned, though, was that when I went to college, I heard about Jesus in a way that I'd never heard about it in the church. And it just revolutionized my life, because all of a sudden this was somebody I wanted to have a relationship with, not somebody I felt like had their thumb on me. And as I just continued to grow in my faith, God did an amazing work in my life. He transformed everything. My parents, of course, thought that I had gone off the deep end because, a little dose of Jesus and God was good, but don't go crazy with it, was their mindset. And, it just didn't work for me, because the more I knew him, the more I wanted to know him better. And my whole life just kind of snowballed towards my relationship with him. And so that's really just kind of where it began. Today, my daughter just got out of college, and the kind of atmosphere she has at college is very different today, because nothing is sort of leading anything towards Jesus. Everything is trying to debunk the entire Christian faith or anything about God or his relevance. And so she is in a completely different culture than I was. But I was just very, very blessed to have an opportunity to get to know who Jesus really was at that season of my life. And, he led me to my wife, led me down the road next steps. So that's kind of how it happened for me.
Well, that's interesting. You the testimony around college. I just interviewed recently Bill Brown, who was a college president of two universities. And we talked about this whole issue of how colleges have kind of gone downhill in many ways, and how it can have a negative impact on someone's faith, as you alluded to, and really that was the case for me. But it's great to hear stories kind of in the reverse, where was it like Campus Crusade for Christ or a ministry in particular that made an
Yes,
impact on you?
it was actually Fellowship for Christian Athletes, FCA,
Okay.
that I went to a Bible study, and I had just never been introduced to the Jesus they talked about.
Right.
It was a completely alien concept to me that there was a God that was loving and compassionate and merciful, and that wanted a relationship with me instead of this, God that I was taught about in an old traditional church in a small town that was just sort of the turn or burn mentality. I mean, you got to be good. You got to do, it was all about being the perfect model, or, it's over kind of thing. So
rules, right?
yes, very much legalism and at its best.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about what your kind of a quick overview of your career, because the podcast is focused mainly around faith and work issues.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always like to dig into kind of where men are with their career right now, as well as kind of the path that got them there. So walk us through kind of after college, what you did and how that led to where you are now.
Okay. Well, after college, of course, it's a paradox that ends up happening in my life, because I had fallen so in love with Jesus and walking with him that a company, a major corporation, IBM, approached me. I had a lot of technical skill sets that attracted them. Plus, they were looking for some young bloods, that they could run up these ladders and put in positions of longevity for the next seasons that they were looking at as the computer world was booming and starting to explode, and all the things were happening. And of course, I was excited about that. And I'll tell you the truth, this is just one of the things. This is why parents are so concerned about their children, because you become who you hang around with. And the more I hung around with some of these people that were more about lifestyle than they were about their faith or their beliefs, the more I tend to look like them. And so, of course, in IBM, I ran up the ladder. They were one thing after another, promotion after promotion. The money, I'm a young kid. They're giving me all this responsibility. Of course, I was patting myself on the back as much as I could because I just thought I'd made it. But it just seemed like I was constantly in a rat race to just keep up with everybody around me, and the compromising and being able to justify things and rationalize things, and it crept into my life more and more and more, and I found myself really, really distant from the Lord. I had immersed myself around people that really didn't have much relationship with anybody, much less the Lord, and it was really unfortunate. I found myself going down those same roads where there wasn't as much time for God anymore, and then eventually there just wasn't hardly any time to even think about God, much less pray or go to church or anything else. And so a lot of things were happening in my life that were unhealthy. But as a young boy that had all kinds of money and all kinds of responsibility and a lifestyle that most people would envy, I thought I had kind of arrived. And, God he just never quit pursuing me. And there was a turning point where my wife, she started praying for me really, really hard. And I didn't know about this at the time, but she prayed and prayed and prayed. And man, my life just started getting a little more abrasive, just living day to day. I just wasn't comfortable anymore. I started feeling emotional about things that I didn't before. Things didn't work out like they were. I mean, stuff was just working out left and right at the beginning, but then all of a sudden nothing was working out. And I didn't realize that a lot of this was a result from prayer until later. But God just used her and honored her prayers. And he just continued to pursue me and brought me back to him, to where one day just this realization of how far I had drifted and how far I'd gone just broke my heart. And I just sort of gave everything up to him. And ultimately, my wife and I started praying a lot together and spent a lot of time with the Lord again. And he just started saying, this is not what I have for you. This is not where I want you. This is not what I want you, or what I want for you. And I was just like, I understand that, Lord, but I mean, how can I give this up? There was all of this resources and everything we wanted. And, we just agreed that it was time for me to try to leave IBM. And at this time, I was already up in a pretty high position, and it was really difficult to resign from there. But my wife rolled over one morning, and we had been talking about me leaving, and I just never could pull the trigger. And she rolled over one morning, and she says, Bill, she says, have you been praying, continued about leaving IBM? And I said, sure, I have. And she said, have you been listening? And of course, I'm like, well, yeah, I have. And she said, well, then why is God yelling at me? She said, something's wrong. And so, of course, that just broke me. And I realized I'd been just skirting the inevitable. If I was going to truly align my life back with the Lord, that I had to be obedient. And so I left. And of course, there was during that season of IBM, you could get blacklisted really quick in any kind of corporate arenas. And they did. They pretty much blacklisted me, and there was no jobs to be found. So I decided to just start a consulting company myself, where I would just try to help businesses and universities and stuff do technology, build networks, infrastructure. And it worked out great. God was really a blessing there. He put me in those places. And all of a sudden, I had all this free time to start ministering to men. And it was weird because I didn't go out looking for them. God brought them to me. And it was like over time, there was 20 men Bible studies, 40 men Bible studies. Next thing, we're taking 100 men to conferences and retreats. And it just kept growing. And this wasn't even in the church. This was just what was happening around the city I was living in. And then the senior pastor at the church I was actually a member of at the time, he walks up to me and he said, Bill, he said, the elders and I have been praying for 10 years that God would raise up a man to lead our men, and we think you're it. And I just laughed. I thought, wait a minute, you don't know what I've done, where I've been. And it didn't really seem to matter to him. It was just clear that God had put me in a position that he wanted to invite me into that. And it was just never on my next steps list to be in ministry. And so, of course, God just continued to open doors and knock down barriers and remove obstacles until all of a sudden, here I am, a pastor at a church, and God has just been faithful, and he has just constantly led my life down that road. And my wife and I, we've just never looked back. We've embraced him through ups and downs, good and bad. And he's just always been faithful with that. And that's pretty much it.
That's awesome. I mean, it's just interesting to hear a little more detail about your background, because our lives intersected, right before you took on that leadership position. Yes. And it made such a difference in my life. I mean, it was exactly where God was leading me at a time when I needed that ministry so much. So I thank you for that.
Well, I appreciate that, Dave. And I just have to tell you, the men that God led to me did such a ministry in my life at that time too. You'll just never realize how he used those men, in the reverse order as well. So right. It was definitely God's finger.
Well, we're going to talk about stewardship today, and I'm going to kind of break it up into different aspects. I mean, there's so many ways we could approach this, but you have kind of a unique perspective. You've been in the marketplace, but then you've spent a significant amount of time immersed with men's ministry and getting to know men in that context. And so I think this topic of stewardship is just right on the money, because it touches on so many different issues. But the first aspect to that I'd like to talk about is time, managing our time as men. So the first thing that comes to mind when I think of this is the term work-life balance, and the fact that we're all so stressed and don't have enough time these days. And so what are your initial thoughts on this whole concept of work-life balance for a Christian man? How should he think of balancing his life?
Well, when you talk about time, Dave, this is one of those areas, stewardship. I love the topic of stewardship, because so many people just think when you say stewardship, you mean money or something like that. And it's just really not. It's a piece of it, but it is so much more than that. Time, it's just an interesting question to consider. Is like, what do we do with all of our time? And I tell you, a lot of people don't feel like they have any free time. They talk about, well, I just don't have time. But if you think about it, if you look back at human history, that people, they used to have to spend almost every bit of their waking hours providing food, clothing, and shelters for themselves and families. I mean, and then they had to work their farms and everything. It was just, there was no free time back in my grandfather's and even in my dad's day when he was a young boy. And yet, according to this last U.S. Department of Labor report that came out, they said that the average age of people over 15 years of age have more than 5 hours of free time every day. I mean, that's almost a third of the time we're awake if you think about it. But it's like, what do you do with it? What do you do with that free time is the part that just really cuts us off at the knees. And you just wonder, is free time even a blessing or a curse these days? Because in my dad's day, when they worked, there was always a purpose for every minute of every hour of the day that they had to get stuff done. Today, we have so many conveniences and things that just, vie for our time and our energy and our focus. And of course, television and internet are two of the biggest social media. They literally consume that entire window of free time that we have. And we don't utilize these things very well with family or the workplace. Most people think, I can't wait to get home to sit on the couch and watch the ball game or watch TV, or I can't wait till something's over so I can go get on social media and talk with my friend. It's sort of this, like, their free time is not like invested wisely anymore. We all do it too. There's no me here preaching about this. I mean, we all do it. We all have those things that reach in and say, this is what this will bring you happiness if you just do this in your free time. And ultimately all it does is burn it up. It doesn't do anything, because then when we're done with it, we think of all these other things that we should have gotten done, and now we don't have any time because it's gone other places. And so entertainment in the world is just one of those things for our mind of where all of our time goes. Instead of being intentional, you have dads that say, I really want to invest more time in my children. But if that dad did a true accounting session of his week in his free time, he would realize that all of the time he had available to invest in his children, he probably watched TV or did something else. And we're all that way. We're all that way in wasting time. So I think with me, Dave, it's just being intentional and having a plan. Schedule it if you have to. I mean, people talk about our lives being on a schedule. Maybe our free time should be on a schedule. Maybe we should literally carve out windows and say, hey, look, if you've got to watch that ball game or that program, here's the hour that you can do that. But it needs to be prioritized, where there's another hour or whatever that is dedicated to more important things. And maybe it just needs to be scheduled. It will have to figure out a way that works for them. But the enemy of that is just not making a plan, not being in. It's like getting out of debt. If you don't have a plan to get out of debt, it's not just going to happen one day. If you sit around long enough, you have to make a plan and then act on it, and then just start prioritizing those things.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I hadn't really thought about it the way you were saying that, in times past, so much of people's time was consumed by kind of, you could say, inefficient. They didn't have the technology that we have
Exactly.
now. There's so many things we have now that we take for granted. Just the basics of getting by and living consumed people's time, and they didn't even have this problem of entertainment. And the other thing that came to mind was a recent interview I had with Dr. Vanderpool, who's a missionary in Haiti, and I asked him the same question about this whole work-life balance, and he kind of said the same thing, that one of the main reasons we all feel so busy is because we fill our available time with entertainment, and we don't think of it that way. We just think,
Right.
oh man, every minute of my day is spoken for, but we don't think about how so much of our time that is spoken for is under our control, and we've just kind of by default let these various activities that may not be our highest priority, and of course the cell phone is a big one. I mean, it's
Yep.
always there to grab and to fill a space of time instead of having that quiet time or using it intentionally.
Yeah. I did a challenge with a young man that I was mentoring, and he had one of the worst cell phone addictions I think I'd ever seen. I mean, he would almost go into sweats if you took his phone away. I mean, he literally could not handle it. And I offered him, and this, of course, I couldn't do this on a large scale. This was just this young man, but he was married, and his wife, they were having a lot of marital problems and everything, but they were also having some money problems. And so what I offered him is I told him, I said, for every day when he gets home after work, if he would power off his phone and give it to his wife, and his wife would confirm to me that he was without his phone all night until the next day, that I'd give him $10. So I was like, look, I'm going to help you with your money problems here, but I'm going to help you with more than that. And I said, so in a week, that's $50, man. I said, if you can do it every night, because he couldn't understand what getting off work meant. He went home, and every time that phone dinged, he'd have to look at it. If it was a work email, he wouldn't wait until tomorrow. It would consume the rest of his night trying to answer that question or respond to that email. And if he couldn't get an answer back, it would consume his thoughts all night where he wasn't present with his family. I mean, it literally consumed him. And so I offered him that challenge, and he took me up on it. And the first night, he confessed that he could not sleep that night. He was so concerned as to what he had missed and what was going on, and if he was going to have a job. I mean, it was crazy thinking. It was stuff that was so abnormal for him to be thinking, but he was thinking the worst case scenario of everything. And then after he realized the world didn't stop spinning and that nobody even knew he turned his phone off, it became very real to him that this was a problem. And so I worked with him for several months to try to break that habit. And now, of course, I'm not still paying him $10, but he goes home every night, puts his phone on the charger, but he powers it off. And any of their family that needs to get them, they call her cell phone. And they'll if there's an emergency or anything, they know that his cell phone will not be on. And he just said, this just saved my life. And we never think of it as that critical, but anybody can get to that place where they are so dependent on that piece of technology and that device.
Well, I guess they say every addiction, the first step is admit your problem, and then
right.
and then take away the opportunity or access to it. So
that's exactly right.
So it's a simple solution, but it makes a lot of sense.
Well, and just so you know, even on top of that, all the marital problems that they were having and financial problems, not because of me. The little bit of money I gave him didn't do anything. But at the nights that they were not doing, he wasn't on his phone and on the TV and everything else, he and his wife were actually reading a devotional together that Billy Graham had put out. And they were doing 2 nights a week, they were doing the FPU from Dave Ramsey, getting on a budget, doing all the things that you're supposed to do when you actually talk to the people you live with. And
right.
So it just gave him space. And all of a sudden he realized just how much free time he had. And he never knew that before.
Well, we're going to talk about money and relationships, but it's interesting how you can tell already how the time issue affects those issues big time. But, the other thing I want to just mention here briefly, we all talk as Christians about how we can't have a relationship with God if we don't spend time with Him, and we all say we should have quiet time, and yet I recently was challenged on that, and just realized how much I had not consistently been having a quiet time, and when you first think about it, it's like, there's just no time. There's no time. But there is time, like you said, 5 hours a day. If we're just intentional about it,
yep.
We'll find the time.
Yeah. They say, Dave, that everyone will find time to do what they want to do, and if they don't, they'll find an excuse. So that's just kind of the way it works.
That's a good quote. All right, so let's talk a little bit about money. You alluded to that a little bit already, and I don't know, the Dave Ramsey thing. I love to talk about Dave Ramsey because it's made such an impact on my life. My wife and I don't know if you remember, Bill, but I was going through a lot of financial troubles when you and I met, and I actually went bankrupt, and my wife and I, we took FPU through a small group,
Mm-hmm.
and we've since facilitated. We've led that class 8 times.
Wow,
So
it's
it's been
fantastic.
it's been a huge part of our life. And I understand the church where you pastor at, you guys did the Momentum program
Yeah,
recently, didn't you?
that's right. Yes.
Yeah. Can you just talk a little bit about that program?
Yeah, the momentum is just a grander scale of FPU where you, as a church body as a whole, you take the entire church through understanding the mindset of it all belongs to God. Everything belongs to Him. You're a steward. You're a manager of His resources, and He gives and He takes those from those areas. And those who are faithful with what He gives you, He gives more, and those who are not, sometimes he just has to wait for you to learn the lessons. But Dave has got such a great personality when it comes to money, because money's such a personal thing with everyone. You got this mindset in the church that the reason people don't like to talk about money in the church is they're going to fight. And they're just like, you can talk about anything else, but just don't talk about my money, because it's so personal. It's emotional for people today. And so when you can take a whole church body through it together, and everybody gets on the same page, and everybody's on baby steps, and they're understanding, hey, this is a marathon, not a sprint. But also we found out that, gosh, when believers can sit down and really talk about money, they can just about talk about anything else and be really real about it. And so we did that. We took 86% of our people through FBU, had just tremendous success, what we would call success in the kingdom, with getting rid of debt and credit cards, and marriages are restored. I mean, we saw so many people come back together that were just about done, throwing up their hands. We saw people that had been on verge of suicide, all kinds of stuff, that this was just at such a perfect time for them. And so, and it's not even about promoting a product or a person or anything like that. It's just the concept. I mean, it's the funniest thing to me how Dave Ramsey has been so successful of teaching common sense. I mean,
Right.
it's so funny to me that all he does is take biblical common sense that God has already put in his Bible for every person.
Right.
And he just packaged it in a way that just makes sense to the culture we live in today. And because everybody that goes through it, they just go, God, this is so simple. Why haven't I been doing this already? And, when people do, like, and like I know, it just changes everything, because you get your finances in order, and you get your priorities lined up, and your time lined up, and everything else. The relationships just about fall in place. I would say the time and the money affect more of our relationships than anything, because we're never present, or we don't have the emotional intelligence to engage in relationships half the time, because we're so worried about our time and our money. And so I think that's the whole circle of stewardship.
Well, I think what I see and what I've experienced is that people who focus the most on money and worry about the most on money are people who aren't managing it in a biblical way. I mean,
Absolutely.
they don't have the freedom of just doing what God wants them to do, because they're a slave to someone or someone who they owe money to, or
Right.
or something that they're upside down on. And so, yeah, it's a huge issue, and one that I don't think gets talked about in churches enough. So I'm glad that your church brought that system in. And the thing I love about Dave is, of course he's very funny, but he gets in your face. He doesn't allow you
Yeah,
to make excuses. He
that's right.
tells it like it is. And
Well, and he kind of reminds you the way your dad used to talk to you about stuff. And that's
yeah,
kind of what I like, is he just he's not there to rate up his approval rating. He's just there to educate people. And I really like that about him. And I can only imagine how many times he has probably done this stuff over and over and over. And I'm just thinking,
right.
oh my goodness, could you imagine if that was all you did, was try to get people to understand common sense?
Well,
But
yeah, I mean, that's the other thing I like about him. He's so consistent. I mean, so many times, it's the flavor of the month. Like, people come and go that teach, write books and teach classes, and
right.
he's just Same advice. You listen to his radio show, someone calls in with a similar problem, same advice every time.
Yep, that's right.
Sell the car, sell the car.
That's right. And they go, "What? I can't. It's like got all the bells and whistles."
That's right. That's great. Well,
and even one last thing on that, the tithe thing. There's so many people that they don't understand the blessing of God. That being from a tithe standpoint, that was one of the things. I think giving is one thing, and that's fine. God will bless the giving that you give, and all. But when you fully understand that a tenth of your income is an act of worship back to God, it's not a payment plan. It's not like you're trying to pay off anything or buy. It's like God. You mean so much more to me than this. You only asked for 10% back, and you're going to give me 90% to just live on and use and do. But it's like how much do I really trust God that the next paycheck or whatever else out there is going to take care of whatever you think that's going to create a void, that 10%. I've had so many people tell me I can't afford to tithe, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I can't afford not to. It's a mindset of worship that comes in. And I think there's just a disconnect the way even a lot of churches teach that these days. Because churches have gotten such a bad rap about all they want is people's money. And trust me, God doesn't need anybody's money. He's given us an opportunity to enter into a place of worship that normally, would not be natural for us. And that's what we were just saying even earlier too. It's like, it's your priority. It's a priority in life of how significant is this opportunity with God, this relationship with God. And many times people are just like, no, it's emotional. I'm connected to it. It's more of a God to me than Jesus is. The money, the almighty Benjamin, kind of thing. And we have so much of the world that bows down to the dollar bill and not God anymore. And that's unfortunately, generationally, that gets taught. And, people just end up missing that.
Yeah, I think I heard a quote from a pastor once that basically that God can't have your heart if he doesn't have your money. And the idea behind that is, not that he needs your money at all, but that to me, money is where the spirit and the natural come together. You know? Exactly. And if you try to separate the two and say, no, money represents my plan on earth and how I'm going to do things, and then I'll put God over here in this box, and you don't understand how they're connected, you're really missing it.
A mentor of mine told me, if you spend more time worried about how you're going to spend your money than how you're going to spend your time with God, there's a problem. And so, it's a human weakness and temptation that we all fight every day we wake up.
Right. Well, let's move on to this issue of stewarding of our relationships. You touched on that a little bit, talking about marriage. Mm-hmm. What do you think are the biggest, or what are the most important relationships in a Christian man's life?
Well, I mean, obviously, the typical answer is of God's first. You got to put God, but I really think everything flows from that. I think if God is first in a man's life, really, really first, not just when you're walking down the hallways of the church or sitting in a Bible study and answering it, but if he really is first in your relationship, the rest of the relationships kind of are just tied together by him. But again, a mentor friend of mine actually showed it to me in a visual where he had a skewer and he had an apple, and he sliced the apple all the way across, just vertical in the big slices. And he said each one of these represents a relationship: your wife, your children, friends, your workplace, the world, and all this. And when it was sliced, the apple, of course, just slid apart, and there's all these pieces to it. But then he put them all back together so it looked like an apple again. He was holding them with his hands, and he takes the skewer and he sticks it right through the middle of it, and it held them all together. And that's always the visual I think of when I look at our relationships. I think if a man has his heart focused on God, that it's so easy for him to recognize the priority of his wife if he's married. And it's not even, he doesn't even have to, think hard on it. It's just normal that this is the primary relationship on earth in the physical form. is a man with his wife. But if God's not in that place, a lot of times a man will get his vision off on his work relationships or what makes him significant in certain circles, or maybe in playing sports or doing something that's going to build his ego, because a man is supposed to get off. But if he's not putting that attention in that relationship, then he's going to go looking for it other places. And it's not necessarily the wife's fault, because if the husband's not leading well, the wife's not responding well. And so everything hangs in the balance by whether a man is truly being a spiritual leader, or if he's just being the guy that, claims that everything he's doing for the family, and he's being good and he's trying to do this and that. It just doesn't sync up. So absolutely, God, the quiet times we were talking about, really spending intimate time with God, listening, spending time with his wife, even if sometimes it's just sitting and looking at stars, in a swing or whatever. Children, though, are actually third in the hierarchy. Today, so many couples put the children above their own marriage, and then they'll even justify it by saying, well, they're kids, they can't do things for themselves, so we have to prioritize them and put them up here. And they literally rule the house and run their lives. And then all of a sudden, one day they graduated and out of the home, and the man and the wife look at each other and they realize they're married to a stranger, because they never invested in that relationship at the level God intended them to. So, you have God, then you have your wife, and then you have your children. And then after that comes, friendships and ministry and church and work, and all of the other things have to fall outside of that bubble. But it just depends on how healthy the man is from where his number one relationship is with the Lord, as to whether or not those things will be in the right order.
Yeah, I think it's so true about the kids, and our pastor has said that the most common time in a person's life when they get divorced is after the last kid leaves, because they haven't been investing in their marriage up to that point. And I agree. I mean, we tend to be, as a culture, very too much kid centered, and got to get them to all these different activities, and if that means there's no time to take your wife on a date, then so be it. And yeah, that's out of balance. I agree.
Yeah, it's and I do. I think with men, it's easy to say these things, and even once we know them. But again, if we don't have a plan, if we don't schedule the things, our time, if we don't manage our money well so that we're consumed by the debt we carry and the bills that are coming, then when you do get a chance to engage with your relationships, it's like sitting there looking at a face with the mouth moving, and you're not even able to enter into that, because all you're thinking about is the money problems, what I'm going to do tomorrow at work. I've got to get this report out, and your wife's sitting here trying to share her heart with you. and so, so many times, if we don't have a plan that says, you know what, I'm going to turn the cell phone off when I go home. I'm going to make sure I align my money and budget, and I'm going to live within my means, not try to keep up with the Joneses, so that I don't have that stress in my marriage and in my family. I'm going to honor God with 1/10 of my resources. I'm going to schedule out everything, and I'm going to protect that time as though it's, the most critical meeting of the day when I get home with my family. I'm going to sit down at the dinner table, have dinner, so that we can talk about things. The kids will turn off their cell phones. It's like, do we have a plan? Can we engage in that? And the truth is, I think some men are just scared to even ask for something that drastic, because we've gone so far down this road of acceptance of being disconnected and electronically interfaced that you'd look like an idiot if you tried to ask people to give up something. And so people go, well, let's just find another way. Well, there's really not one. Until you said it before, until you take the addictive thing or whatever it is, until you remove it, then there's no reason to make any other efforts until it's there. And so if the debt is killing you, remove it, make a plan, get out of debt. If time management is killing you and you say, I have no time, well, then you need to get a calendar and a day planner and figure out, when you come home, turn turn the phone off, make a plan. I'm going to commit this time to my family only, not going to answer phones or emails. I'm not going to look at a computer. We're going to turn the TV off. You can turn it on later and watch a program, but it's like protect certain amounts of time and make a commitment, because the truth is your children are learning from your example. And I learned that was one of the things I had to apologize to my daughter for, is that I realized there were many years of my life I set an example that she was learning from. And it became very difficult for us at later time to have that conversation about we need to protect this time together. And so, relationships all hinge on those two, whether we make a plan and follow through with it and have discipline and accountability and whatever else needs to be involved in that. But it's easy to talk about. It sure is hard to do.
Well, you got to be willing to disrupt the status quo too, don't you?
Right. Well,
Which
even be the bad guy, so to speak, if it comes to the no phones at the table or something. It's just
right. I want to talk about this issue of the friends thing, because I would like to hear your take on this, because on the one hand, we say family is most important and the friends are less important, and you don't want to be, running around with the guys and leaving your wife and kids at home. But at the same time, it's important to have Christian brothers to talk to, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, the thing that in my life that I've witnessed with men that have success in all of these areas is those men are surrounded by other men that are willing to walk in a noble walk with each other and say, hey, look, we all recognize we don't have it all together and we're not going to be perfect and we're going to fall and trip and stumble, but I need you to have my back. I need you to love me, but correct me and hold me accountable. And don't give me a lot of slack when I try to justify it or rationalize it. But I need you to love me in that way in Christian brotherhood so that I can win. And every man wants to win. I think every man wants to win in family, in business, in personal growth with his Lord. I mean, I think every man aspires to that. I don't think that's a secret to anybody. But most men, even though common sense, as we were talking earlier, teaching common sense would tell you, if you don't have other men walking with you, holding you accountable, cheering you when you're winning and cheering you on to successes and everything, if you don't have those things and you're left alone to your own mental thinking and your own, devices and all, it's going to be a whole lot harder in that way, because I think if we could do it by ourselves, we would have already done it. And so, that's what I think is so critical, is that men are too private. They're too personal. They want to keep their secrets hidden. They don't really want to be exposed in any areas. But what they don't realize is that's the very bondage that's keeping them from winning in all the areas they so desperately want to.
Yeah, the devil can use isolation for sure.
Big time.
We started out talking about how this whole concept of that you become who you hang around with, and based on you talked about your testimony earlier, that really applies to this as well, doesn't it? I mean,
Yep.
Jesus, I've heard it said Jesus understood the importance of being around large groups of people, and then being around a smaller group, and then having that intimate group of 3 men that he was closest to, and that, would you agree that that's a model for us to follow as well?
Oh, absolutely. And I think you have to be okay with the fact that there are some people you just don't need to be friends with in life. And I don't mean be ugly to, or that Jesus didn't die for them just like he did for you, but the influence that people have on our lives is tremendous. And if those people are in close proximity to our lives on a regular basis, you will tend to find yourself leaning towards that gravitational pull of compromise, justification, laughing at the jokes that are off taste or off color, and just chalking it up to that's just the way Bob is. And after a while, it's that slow fade of just becoming like the world. And sometimes you just have to, love people and be compassionate, but you don't have to be friends with people that are not going to influence you towards that walk that would honor Christ. And so I believe that friendships are tremendous and very powerful, but they can be powerful in two different directions, either positive or negative. And while we're always concerned about who our daughter's going to spend the night with and what other girls are going to be there and we're always worried about who all's going to be there, and they don't understand that. They don't get the significance of it. But we also know that influence is extremely, extremely strong in our world and our culture. And the people you hang around influence you tremendously. They influence our children tremendously. They influence our spouses tremendously. Even to the points of affairs and immoral choices. Most people didn't wake up one morning and say, I think I'm just going to go cheat on my wife. It's like over time, you hang around the cute little blonde in the cubicle and you have conversations, and then you find yourself finding out what her favorite cookie was, and then you go all the way across town to get one for her so you could give it to it. It's like, how did that happen? It's not just one day. There was this influence, and we didn't have guardrails. And we didn't have boundaries, and it just kind of perpetuates. And the same thing happens in just normal friendships. And so I always say, there's a reason that the Bible teaches us about surround yourself with godly men, godly counsel, wise counsel. Don't just don't try to just be Mr. Popular. Find people that you want to be, honed by in the way your life works. And then put yourself in the middle of those people. Put people in there that can invest in you things that you don't have, that can grow you to places and things that you haven't arrived at. But again, we live in this world of convenience and ease. And it's just sort of like, well, these are just happen to be the people that are in my cubicle or at my workplace. So these are my friends now. And over time, you'll see the draw, just like when I was in IBM, the way that magnet just drew me away from how close I was to the Lord before. Devastated me. I would have never, ever believed you if you had told me that would happen to me. But it's such a slow fade, you don't see it happening.
Well, let's say that you've found those right guys, the guys that are the right influence. Do you have any suggestions on how best to invest in that friendship with the understanding that you may have other priorities, and you do have other priorities? So how do you what are some suggestions you might have on to how to build friendships once you've got good friends?
Yeah, I think building and investing in those kinds of friendships are very worthwhile too. I think you just have to be straight with a man. I think if a man walks up to another man and says, "Hey, I see so many godly characteristics in your life, and I would love to walk life with a man like that because that is what I'm wanting to do in my life. What do you think about us meeting regularly? What do you think about us getting a couple of guys and let's study God's word, or let's have dinner, every so often, or let's start a life group at my house and talk about what it means to be a godly man, and then let's walk with each other so that we can all win." I think if a guy walked up to another man, especially if that was his desire, I think that would be just a breath of fresh air, that somebody would be so direct about what I'm looking for. And most men, believe it or not, I think would jump at an opportunity to be part of a group of men like that. But again, like I said, somebody has to lead. Somebody has to start and say, this is important enough for me in my life that I'm going to seek this out. So I'm going to look for these men. And when I find them, I'm going to identify them. I'm going to pray that God will go before me. And then I'm going to approach each one of them, and I'm going to invite them on a journey with me. And if they all go, great. But if some don't, that's their choice. Some will. And it's just the boldness of Christ, even as he walked up to the disciples and said, "Come follow me." He didn't say, "Hey, how you doing? What, do you feel like hanging out with me for a little while? Would you like to?" He just said, "Come follow me." I mean, it's just bold. And I just don't think men do that anymore. We shy away from boldness these days because we're scared of what the answers may be. So I think it's just a matter of taking a risk and letting God prove to you that he's working all things together for the good of those that he loves, and just see it just unfold and transpire right there in front of you.
Sounds great. Well, I think we're out of time. Do you have any final thoughts? This has been an awesome conversation about a really important topic. But before we wrap up, do you got any final thoughts you want to share?
Well, I mean, I feel like I've talked way too much already, Dave, but I would just encourage guys to just never give up on the call that we all feel on our hearts to be stronger men of God. Whatever position he's put us in our lives, whatever circle he has put us in, That is the territory that God has entrusted us to, talking about stewardship. That circle that we live in, it has money, it has time, and it has relationships in it. It's not about the whole world. It's about the world that God has put around us. And how are we managing those things for him? How are we handling those? And sometimes it just takes sitting down with a piece of paper and writing it out so that you can really understand what God has put around you. And then start praying. God, open my eyes to the things I don't see here and let me be exposed to them, and then lead me. Let me move forward in whatever it is. If I need men walking with me in my life, lead me to those men. If I need to manage my money better, God, help me get on a budget and help me be disciplined, and help me and my wife to both do it together so we're on the same page. If it's time, get a paper day planner, not a digital one. Get a paper one that hangs on the wall and looks at you every day when you start violating it. And just put things in play that'll make a real difference, and then watch God show up. That's the best advice I could give a man today, because a man will always be able to do what he wants to do, or he'll come up with an excuse why he can't. And that's just the bottom line for men today.
All right. If anyone wanted to follow up with you, Bill, learn more about your ministry, or just talk to you, how would they go about doing that?
Well, they could email me at bmcgee@compassionchristian.com. And I check my email quite regularly, except at night when I'm home with my wife. So, but I'll gladly respond back and try to answer any questions I can, and love to try to.
Well, sounds great. Thanks for your time, and have a great day.
Okay, Dave, you too, buddy. Bye-bye.
All right, bye. Men at Work, I hope you've enjoyed this interview as much as I have. We just heard about Bill McGee's journey being spirit-led at his work and living out his Christian faith through his work. Each of our journeys are unique, but hopefully you've heard something in this episode to inspire you and give direction for your own personal daily work life. You can find links and other information from this show at davehilgendorf.com. Until next time, have a great day and God bless.